The stories I'm about to tell contain factual information obtained from news reports dating back to the 1950s. These articles are tangible proof of events that occurred decades before I was born. Unfortunately, my personal belief that these incidents may have left something unnatural behind cannot be presented as easily as the report I'm currently holding in my hand. No matter how much I believe it to be true, I'm unable to produce evidence of such a thing. But my intention here isn't to prove the existence of the paranormal. My goal is to simply disclose the findings of my research and to share details of the strange events that occurred in the place I once called home for the first 18 years of my life. I grew up in a home on Stratford Drive, a residential street located in central Tucson's Broadmoor neighborhood. As unbelievable as this may sound, every once in a while, a shadow figure of a man would walk past our dining room window. His journey was always fleeting. His directional path, northbound from our driveway, never changed. He appeared to be of average height and weight, with good posture. This mysterious entity was just one of the many ghostly visitors that appeared to be drawn to my childhood home, for reasons I believe may be connected to the wave of tragedy that once swept through Stratford Drive. Death, in various forms including murder and suicide, came to Broadmoor and began claiming the lives of those occupying this Tucson street that covers an area less than a mile long. Neighbors were dying within months of each other. 26 reported deaths, 23 alone over a 9-year period. While these numbers may not be incredibly shocking by today's standards, they were certainly upsetting at the time. Could these unfortunate incidents be the cause of some of the disturbances seen and heard at my former home? Do the spirits of those who once lived on Stratford Drive linger there? More on this and a look back at the incredibly dark history of this Tucson location. Welcome to Episode 1 of El Presidio Project.
Uncovering the creepy side of the old Pueblo. This is El Presidio Project. Strange Tales of Tucson.
Hello everybody, thanks for taking the time to check out El Presidio Project. My name is Dini and I will be hosting this podcast, which will mainly feature local ghost stories, urban legends, and true crime events that have occurred right here in Tucson. When creating this podcast, I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to kick things off with a personal story. But I'm very new to this medium, and putting together something I was familiar with really helped me get through the process. Now, before I get into today's topic, I'd like to mention a couple of things. One, I really wanted to include my love of horror films and other media related to this genre in this podcast. I find that many people who enjoy creepy stories are inclined to appreciate the occasional scary movie. I really hope you are one of those people, because at the end of each episode, there will be a short segment dedicated to that as well. The second thing I wanted to mention is due to the sensitive nature of some of the cases I will be discussing today. The names of the deceased and the accused have been changed for this presentation. So with that said, here is Episode 1, Stratford. Located near the grounds of what was once the site of Tucson's first golf course and country club, the family subdivision known as Broadmoor was considered to be one of the finest residential communities in the city at the time of its inception. Many of the residents were highly respected members of the city's social elite. Oftentimes, their fancy reception dinners and cocktail parties were featured in the society pages of the local newspaper. For those living outside of Broadmoor's borders, it appeared as though life on the inside of this prominent and seemingly safe community was perfect. But in the winter of 1952, a report of a violent crime involving a cherished family pet challenged that theory. Mrs. Allen of Stratford Drive had been desperately searching for her missing dog. The fox terrier had been lured away from its yard by an unidentified person. A week later, the dog was found in a desert area nearby. Mrs. Allen was notified. When she arrived at the scene, she discovered someone had brutally killed her beloved companion. The dog had been tied down and beaten. Sadly, and perhaps a bit strange as well, Mrs. Allen died a year later. She was 45 years old. Soon after, another violent crime was reported, this time involving a human victim. In the early morning hours of December 19, 1954, a motorist traveling on the Nogales Highway discovered the body of a woman approximately 1 mile north of the small town of Sahuarita, Arizona. The victim was identified as 44-year-old Stratford Drive resident Janice Halcomb. At first, officials believed Mrs. Halcomb had been the victim of a hit-and-run accident, possibly carried out by her estranged husband, real estate salesman Phil Halcomb. According to newspaper reports, Mr. Halcomb was stopped by a highway patrolman on the Nogales Highway the night of his wife's death. The patrolman stated the motorist was pulled over due to a burned-out and broken headlight. After a brief roadside conversation with the officer, Mr. Halcomb was released. Later that day, Mr. Halcomb confessed to police that he and his wife were on their way back from Mexico when he blacked out at the wheel. He admitted to crashing into something, but claimed he couldn't remember what that something was. The highway patrolman would later testify Mr. Halcomb made no mention of his wife or his collision with an unknown object during the routine stop. Fender paint and headlight pieces taken from Phil Halcomb's car were compared to paint and glass fragments recovered from his wife's body. They did not match. It appeared someone else was to blame for Mrs. Halcomb's untimely demise. But when pathologist Dr. Lewis Hirsch revealed the results of the autopsy, Mr. Halcomb became the lead suspect once again. According to Dr. Hirsch, Janice Halcomb was already dead when she was struck down by a moving vehicle. In his medical opinion, the victim had died from a fatal blow to the head, an injury he claimed not caused by a car accident. Furthermore, dirt samples taken from the body did not match the soil found in the area where Mrs. Halcomb was ultimately discovered. These revelations led investigators to suspect the victim's body had been moved from the site of her murder and possibly dumped on the Nogales Highway. This previously suspected accident-turned-murder investigation brought scandal to Broadmoor. Someone among them had been accused of the unthinkable. On March 16, 1955, Phil Halcomb was arrested at his Stratford Drive residence. A newspaper report states one of the arresting officers asked Mr. Halcomb, "Does your conscience bother you?" To which he replied, "God will be my judge." The Halcomb murder trial went on for months, but in the end there was not enough evidence to prove, without a reasonable doubt, that Mr. Halcomb was guilty of murdering his wife. No blood was ever found in Mr. Halcomb's car or home, and a murder weapon was never recovered. A directed verdict, the first in Pima County's history, was ordered by Judge Robert S. Tuller. "Of course, a first-class mystery is present here," said the judge. "That is why the courtroom has been crowded every day. And I am certain that none of you 14 jurors or I am in a position to solve it. I have no other alternative than to grant the motion and have prepared this verdict for you to sign. We, the jury, do find the defendant not guilty under direction of the court." The tragic murder of Mrs. Janice Halcomb remains unsolved to this day. Misfortune continued to rain down on the residents of Stratford Drive. In June of 1960, the life of a 13-year-old middle school student was cut short due to illness. 3 months later, at the same residence, a 60-year-old male died as well. In January of 1961, a fatal car crash took the life of 30-year-old Henry Anders. It wasn't long after another Stratford Drive resident, an elderly female, passed. Her husband died that summer. October of 1963 brought news of yet another murder. The victim, 36-year-old Thomas Mullins, was shot and killed by a jealous husband. The report states Mr. Mullins and a friend were visiting with 25-year-old Beverly Gray at her home when her estranged husband walked in with a gun and began making threats. Mullins tried to disarm the man and was shot in the struggle. Mrs. Gray was shot as well but survived the attack. Thomas Mullins of Stratford Drive left behind a wife and 6 children. 2 other deaths occurred that same year, a 57-year-old female and a 64-year-old male. They were neighbors. 5 short months after the Mullins murder, 33-year-old Dorothy Borelli, a divorced mother of 5, shot and killed Davis-Monthan Air Force Major Julius Lynch at his home. The Stratford Drive resident then turned the gun on herself and committed suicide. According to homicide detectives, the couple had recently broken up per Mr. Lynch's request. On the night of the incident, Mrs. Borelli left a note addressed to her children. The youngest was 3 years old. From March of 1964 to March of 1969, 14 other Stratford Drive residents would pass on, including 18-year-old James Rourke of an apparent suicide, a female infant, and acquitted murder suspect Phil Halcombe, who died at a local hospital at the age of 55. During the first few years of the new decade, it seemed like peace had finally come to the residents of this central Tucson street. This period of tranquility would come to an abrupt end in 1974, when another teen suicide was reported. The following year, illness took the life of the woman who once resided in the place I would eventually call home. My family moved to Stratford Drive in the winter of 1975. Soon after, friends and relatives alike began hearing strange noises throughout the house. Conversations conducted in hushed tones were heard coming from an empty bedroom. Mysterious footsteps on the roof were often heard as well. At one point, my grandmother invited a local priest to come by and bless the house. But the noises and the sightings continued. The following clip you're about to hear is part of a conversation I recently had with my mom, where she describes a disturbing event that took place in the spring of 1977.
It was late at night, and I was washing dishes, and so from the corner of my eye, I saw a young man coming down the hallway. He was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt, but he seemed to be walking and holding the wall behind him with his arms stretched out. And I thought at that moment that it was my brother, that he had heard some noises outside. So I continued to wash dishes. Then a few minutes went by and I didn't see my brother come back. So at that point I left the kitchen, went towards the side door, and started calling my brother's name and thinking he was outside. And of course there was no answer. So I immediately ran to his bedroom, and my brother was sound asleep. And so needless to say, I startled him when I told him what had happened or what I had seen. So that night I could not sleep. I was very disturbed about what I had seen. And so basically that's my story.
So what is it that you think you saw?
I believe that what I saw was an apparition.
Do you believe this apparition was, not a kind spirit?
No, I can't say that. Again, I thought it was my brother. So this is what is the scary part about this. So the creepy part, that it wasn't.
Right.
So whoever it was of the unknown.
So you didn't really have a chance to feel anything other than, what is this thing I just saw?
No, it happened after I realized that it wasn't my brother. And this is when I became creeped out by this.
Have you ever felt or seen anything like that again?
No. my family members have, at that point, had seen or heard, but it had never happened to me. So until that night.
Whatever you saw, whatever anyone else who had talked about experiences at that house, what would you say to someone that would say it was all in your head? It was all, you let your imagination get away with you.
Well, I mean, people can say or analyze what they want. I know personally what I saw, and to this day, I still think about that. And so it was definitely something that was not, I would say, would be again an apparition or a ghost.
Our former home on Stratford Drive will always pose more questions than answers. We'll never receive confirmation of the reasons behind the haunting events that happened there, nor will we ever be able to prove their existence. But the impact they made on our lives is very real. I'd like to end this portion of the podcast with a passage from Colin Dickey's book, Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places, which states, "Though this belief lies outside the ways we normally explain the world, contradicting science and complicating religion, it's a difficult belief to shake. That we continue believing in ghosts despite our rational mind skepticism suggests that in these stories lies something crucial to the way we understand the world around us. We cannot look away because we know something important is there." Coming up, the very first installment of the Weekend Creepshow Report. I'll be discussing the films Dig Two Graves and Beyond the Gates, and my recent encounter with Captain Spaulding himself, Mr. Sid Haig.
The good, the bad, and everything in between. It's the Weekend Creepshow Report.
Before I get into what I'm about to say, I'd like to share some background info on this segment dedicated to the world of horror films and other scary fictional works. When I was a little girl, the first horror movie I ever saw that I was able to enjoy and talk about with my friends was Creepshow. If you're not familiar with the film, it's a 1982 anthology horror that features 5 stories. It was written by Stephen King and directed by George A. Romero. Admittedly, I was probably too young for that kind of dark humor and gore, but I was all about it. Especially after I found the comic book adaptation at the local library. I thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen. So the cover art, I'm not sure if that's the technical term for it, for this podcast, and the name of this segment is a little nod to the awesomeness that is Creepshow. Anyway, during the weekends, when I'm not busy doing other things, I try to see as many movies and TV series episodes as I can. I didn't get a chance to see any TV stuff this weekend, but I did see 2 movies that are available right now on Netflix. The first movie was 2014's gothic thriller Dig Two Graves, which became available on demand back in March of this year. I was really impressed with this independent film, which is about a young girl grieving the loss of her brother. She's eventually approached by 3 mysterious men, one of which offers to bring her brother back to life. There's a backstory as well involving the young girl's grandfather, played by Ted Levine, who of course is known for his role as Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. The movie jumps back and forth from the 1940s to the 1970s. I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but it's definitely worth a look if you're into thrillers. I thought the acting was great and the story was extremely well told. The second movie I saw was 2016's Beyond the Gates, which tells the story of 2 brothers who sort of inherit their missing father's video store. Their dad has been gone for months, and they're pretty sure he's not coming back. So they begin to pack up the place, and they come across a creepy VHS board game with an ominous guide played by Barbara Crampton, who's been in films like Reanimator, From Beyond, and You're Next. Beyond the Gates has some pretty amusing old-school gore. Keep an eye out for the voodoo doll scene. I enjoyed it and would recommend it to anyone out there looking for a little throwback to the glory days of 80s horror films. Last but definitely not least, I wanted to share a story about my brief meet and greet with actor Sid Haig at Mad Monster HorrorCon in Phoenix, which took place just a few weeks ago. This was my first HorrorCon experience. I've attended Comic-Con in San Diego and Phoenix, and I make it a point every year to support my local Tucson Comic-Con. But this was the first time I had ever gone to a convention that was specifically geared towards horror fans. It was awesome. I'm already looking forward to next year's con. So I attended Sig Haig's panel, and after that was over, a bunch of us made our way to his table. We waited in line for a bit, and when my turn came up, I got a little nervous. I wasn't scared of him or anything like that. That would have been silly. But I was somewhat starstruck, I guess. But he couldn't have been nicer. He signed an 8x10 photo of himself as Captain Spaulding, and I got so caught up in the moment that I almost walked away without paying for it. Luckily, I caught myself, and I said, "Oh man, I almost walked away without paying you. What's up with that?" And he kind of leaned in a bit and very Captain Spaulding-esque goes, "Well, I would have had to track you down." I said, "Well, I certainly wouldn't want that," which made him chuckle a bit. It was an absolute pleasure meeting him. I think it did wonders for my clown phobia. I won't get into that right now, but the remake of Stephen King's It is coming soon, so I'm sure there's a potential relapse in my future. Seriously though, if you're a fan of horror films, art, games, comic books, I would highly recommend you checking out a horror con near you. So that's it, everyone. This concludes the inaugural episode of El Presidio Project. If you'd like to follow El Presidio Project on social media, I've just created a Facebook page and Twitter account for it. They're probably looking pretty bare right now, but I will be posting information on future episodes and other stuff very soon. Also, if by chance anyone out there is listening who currently lives in Broadmoor and you happen to have a creepy story about Stratford Drive, I'd really like to hear from you. You can drop me an email at elpresidioproject@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye-bye.